Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Hi, everyone. It's Tamara Taggart, and I am really excited today. Today, we are speaking with National Chief Roseanne Archibald, who is the first woman to hold the post of National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. She is from the Takwa-Tagamo Nation and has 31 years of experience in First Nations politics. Welcome, National Chief. So good to see you.
Yeah, thank you, Tamara.
Now, I have never spoken to a national chief before. This is the first time. What is the proper protocol for me to call you?
Just national chief or chief, either of
Okay.
those. Sometimes
Okay.
people say grand chief, but it's actually not the title.
Oh, okay. Good to know. So chief is okay as we move
Yeah.
forward here?
hmm
Perfect. So, I mean, we've had a lot of big things have happened, I think, for Indigenous women in the last couple of months. We've seen, our Governor General and now our National Chief, and there's some really big movement happening. How significant is this for Indigenous women to see other Indigenous women in such significant places of I don't know if power is the right word or I guess. I mean, that's what we would say about a man, I guess. But, I'm really curious as to how this all feels to you as an Indigenous woman.
The first part of your question is about how other Indigenous women see it. And I do get a common reaction wherever I have been traveling, and that is First Nation women, because I've been traveling to First Nation communities across Canada since I got elected. And the common response to meeting me is often one of great pride for women. They're so happy to see themselves reflected in this role. They feel it's long overdue. And I said this when I actually got elected, that the victory was actually not for me personally. It was really a victory for all women, particularly First women. But I've also had a lot of positive comments from non Indigenous women as well. So it has a broader kind of feeling for women. And I think that that's amazing. Like when I go to communities, almost all of the photographs that I'm asked for are by First Nation women because they see themselves finally in this very important role. And for me, though, what it feels like for me looking from the inside out is that I'm quite an ordinary person, a little bit boring, I would say. My exciting thing is to make sure, my laundry's done on the weekend and my house is clean.
Sounds like a
Um,
lot of us.
but, it's an extraordinary role, and that's what I'm always aware of. Even though I see myself as a very regular person, I know that this role is very significant. And so I often think about, the idea of being a regular, everyday First Nation woman who has been given this extraordinary opportunity and not only the opportunity to be the national chief, but to inhabit this role in a way that it's never been inhabited before, and to be able to bring my own 31 years of experiences to the role is important as well. So it feels monumental, and I'm aware of it, especially when I travel.
hmm So, I mean, so this is an elected position. So there may be people listening that have no idea what a national chief does. No idea that you're elected to this position. Who votes for you? How does that work? This is I mean, one of the great things I think, Chief, about I mean, it was everywhere in the news, everywhere that I looked. I was on the edge of my seat throughout the whole thing. And I think it brought a lot of attention to people because you're the first woman. So that became a news headline. And then there was like a little bit of, I don't know if controversy is the right word, but there were some politics within the politics, it appeared, from the outside looking in. So I'm going to assume that there are politics within politics. And as great as I think it is as a woman looking at you and watching what you're doing and feeling incredibly proud, how can you maybe explain, like, how do you become the national chief? How do you get to this level?
Well, you are elected only by chiefs, first of all. So it's really more of an appointment process. An election, in my mind, means democracy. It means one person per vote. So many people get to vote for a government, and that happens in First Nation communities, but it doesn't happen in this role. So it is somewhat of an election. But it's not really a democratic election the way I believe it needs to be. We're just not there yet. I mean, this is what I am trying to fix as the national chief, is that the Assembly of First Nations is a corporation. And what's even more difficult about being a woman, because I was a woman at the table as a regional chief for 3 years, and now I'm the national chief. I think the difficulty is that this corporation is actually called the National Indian Brotherhood. That's the actual name of the corporation. And so how do you democratize a corporation? Well, you can't really, because it still is just a corporation. And so my work is to try and begin to separate the political aspect. I shouldn't say separate, I think that's not the word, is to really create a healthy boundary between the political part of this organization and the corporate part of this organization. That's the administration. And that's the work ahead, because what you want is for people to be able to vote for the national chief when the national chief is a political position, not a corporate position, because then we begin to get into areas where First Nation rights are being, are falling under a corporate structure that is recognized under the federal, regulations and laws. So I think it gets a little bit complicated as we start to think about how do we create democracy within First Nations so that the national chief is elected by the people. And that's the path forward. And the other part of your question about politics within politics, I have always looked at leadership as a very spiritual and sacred calling. And that calling for me is grounded in the values of our people, the principles of leadership. And so particularly the 7 sacred teachings. And out of those, I would say that I have focused on love, and not in that sort of romantic Hollywood sense, but the love that we feel for our children, our grandchildren, our families, our extended families, that real familial kind of love and care. And so politics, I've said this at many meetings so far, with me as the national chief, it's not politics as usual. And I'm a truth teller, and I've made comments in the media. I've had news releases where I've been working at truth in a way that isn't hurtful, because sometimes the truth is difficult. And that's the age we're in right now. People talk about reconciliation, but there actually can't be reconciliation without truth. Truth actually has to be the leader, the thing that goes ahead of reconciliation. And we're just getting there now with the recovery of our little ones in these unmarked graves across Canada. So that's a big, long answer to your question.
And gosh, I just find the whole thing fascinating about like how I know you're a third generation chief, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
And you're now, I mean, you talked about breaking the glass ceiling, right? It's broken now for Indigenous women. And I think that it's just so powerful and really fascinating to talk to you about. But there's so many things to talk to you about. And you just mentioned a couple of them. So let's talk about September 30th. September 30th is our new statutory holiday. It's the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. This is the first one. And it's this is your national chief, and we are having our first September 30th. And as you look at, you have a 100-day action plan also. So there's so much to talk about here. And you talked about the truth, and then we get to the reconciliation. What are you, how do you push the government to implement these calls to action that, it's been a while, since 2015. How do we push forward to get these calls to action done?
Well, allies are really important to this process. First Nations have been talking about these things for at least 150 years since Canada was formed as a country. And this process is a long process for us, but it's new for many Canadians, especially with the recovery of our little ones. That really struck a heart chord in regular Canadians because we all love our children. And it really helped Canadians to understand that these institutions of assimilation and genocide, that I don't call them schools anymore because there aren't graveyards at schools. And a school, and I read something else that I thought was so brilliant. It was a man who said, going to school should not increase the likelihood of your death. I thought, my gosh, yeah, that's about it. It's supposed to be a place of learning, and those places were not. And so I'm sort of digressing and going on a bit of a tangent, but September 30th and that day is extraordinarily important, and it's important for allies to stand with us. And it's important for allies to call on government to implement all of the TRC calls to action. And that means that our allies have to read that document. And there is a very small sort of handbooky, and I carry it with me when I travel because I want to review them. I want to, sort of, where are we on these? Where are we moving on the 94 calls? And it's a small booklet with the actual 94 calls. And every Canadian needs to read that, at least that. If we can get Canadians to read the whole report, our country will be transformed. This country will be transformed. And so this government is elected by the majority of Canadians, and that's the important role that allies play and that allyship plays in the healing path forward, which is what we've called our election document. And it really is. We really need to find a healing path forward, because it's one thing to acknowledge these atrocities, to acknowledge the genocide, to acknowledge what has happened to our children. That's one step. The next step is, how do we heal from it? How do we begin to walk forward so that we're carrying that love for children in our hearts, and that we're making sure that it never happens again? Because it's actually happening right now. There is the child welfare system. There are birth alerts. One of my staff, who is an amazing, accomplished woman, when she had her daughter in the Maritimes, I believe is in Nova Scotia, the Children and Family Services came to her her actual hospital room and said, "Do you want to put your child up for adoption?" And I was just like, "What?" I was so surprised because I know that birth alerts have been an issue where the CAS, the Child and Family Services, Children Aid Societies interrupt Indigenous First Nations parenting. But if you met Shelley, you would be really surprised that they would come to her and ask her that question. She's very articulate, educated, well spoken. And the fact that a CAS worker would actually go up to her and say, "Hey, do you want to put your child up for adoption?" is absolutely ludicrous. And that happened to women, and it's still happening actually in many places. But I don't, Tamara, if you can even imagine somebody coming to your hospital and asking you, "Hey, Tamara, do you want to put up your baby for adoption?" It's just, that's
Well, I mean, it would never happen to me,
right.
Chief. It wouldn't happen to me.
That's the great injustice.
Yes,
Is that
exactly.
it should not, it really has to stop happening to First Nation women. And so
Well,
that's
there's
the role of
story after story. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, we see it all the time in the news across the country. And we have for years. And you're absolutely right. It's appalling. And I know that it happens here in British Columbia too, because I know Indigenous women who work in the hospitals, and they've seen it before, and we've shared those stories, and it's appalling. So how do non-Indigenous Canadians support Indigenous Canadians to move forward in our reconciliation, in our truth, how do we support, besides reading the 94? I mean, I agree with you. Every Canadian should do that. I think every Canadian should read the Indian Act. I mean, I don't think people understand what the Indian Act is. They hear about it, but they don't understand how racist and discriminatory it is. They don't understand. It's not hard to read the Indian Act either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Well, you have to call your MPs and your MPPs and your mayors and your councillors, and you have to call the levels of government that you are actually electing, because you're the electorate. You're the people who have, and we all have that right. It's just that First Nation voices, like many BIPOC, which is, all of the different colors of people and racialized communities, have the same problem of asking for justice and not being heard. But once a non-Indigenous person does it, then something begins to happen. And I actually read about Desmond Cold. I'm not sure if you know Desmond, but he is a writer and an activist, and he was writing various op-eds about carding in Toronto and how wrong it was, and that community for 10 years struggled to get it changed. And one day, one of the elite in Toronto read his op-ed and said, "This is wrong," and took a bunch of his elite friends to the City Hall in Toronto and held a press conference and said, "This has to end." And it did. And so that's the power that non-Indigenous people have, is that it doesn't take it doesn't take every single Canadian to stand up, although that would be fantastic. And that's what September 30th is about giving non-Indigenous people across Canada a day to reflect, a day to learn, a day that is a space for them to understand that if they do have a holiday, it's because of what has happened at these institutions of assimilation and genocide. It gives them that opportunity to reflect and have that day off to do something, perhaps, in their own way. But it does take a small group. There's a quote, it takes a small group of like-minded people to change the world. And so if allies feel like if they can even do a group of them get together and do some actions, it's going to have a huge impact.
You said the word genocide. That seems to be a word that some people in this country, in positions of power and with the ability to change a lot, can't seem to say that word. How important is it to acknowledge that it is genocide?
There are thousands of children being discovered in unmarked graves. I'm not sure what more people need to understand that that's genocide, that crimes were committed. You don't take a child and bury them in an unmarked grave. That's actually what murderers do. And so that's what's happened. So for people to balk at the word, they only have to look at what has happened to understand that that is the appropriate word, that crimes have been committed, crimes against humanity, crimes against our children. And I'm still calling for those crimes to be investigated, and that we go to the international level as well, to the International Criminal Court, and advance our issues there to the United Nations, because the United Nations has called it genocide, and we call it genocide. So I think people have to begin to understand that it happened in Canada, and that it was a government process, but it is the people who elected that government who participated in that genocide. And now is the time for the people in today's society to call on these governments for reparations and to make right what has happened in the past. That's the path forward. There's very little that you can do about the past in terms of going backwards, because you can't go back in time. But there are things you can do now. And reparations to First Nations is a big part of that.
I guess what I was trying to say in a subtle way was, how important is it for the Prime Minister of our country to say the word genocide?
I believe that he has used it, but maybe not in the context of this is genocide. But I was in Manitoba for a treaty gathering, and the Minister of Indigenous Affairs and Reconciliation had some problems with Wab Kinew when he was doing a press conference and was alluding to the fact that, we're not sure if this was genocide, and was making comments that were very, very difficult for survivors to hear. And Wab Kinew actually confronted him, and he then, received an education about what's really happened. And when I was at that event, he said in his speech that this is genocide. He had really moved from that original thinking that he had upon his appointment to that position to actually saying, yes, this is genocide. So I thought that was significant, because he was also a conservative MPP or MLA in Manitoba.
Right. Okay. So the murdered and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. What are your, as national chief, what are your recommendations? How do you see us moving forward on this? I mean, it's just, you have such a massive job. So I'm there's another genocide, really. I mean, when you look at how many girls and women have been murdered and are still missing, some of them. So what are your recommendations on moving forward on this?
We have to look again to the history of First Nation women going back to contact. So these non-Indigenous men were violent with our women. They would kidnap them and sexually assault them. And they were not respectful to our women. And there are stories about our men in the remote north who would see the voyageurs or the fur trade non-Indigenous men coming up the river, and they would take their women inland, because that's how long this problem has existed in this country. It's not a recent phenomenon. It has actually been happening from the beginning of contact. And a big part of that is that Indigenous First Nation women have to be valued. They have to be respected. It has to be understood that First Nation women are loved and cared for by their community. And there's also, even within our community, the violence that has happened to women inside of our communities as well by our own men. And that to me is a part of the colonial history, that learned behavior of, not understanding the value of women, not respecting women. That is certainly an issue within our community that we have to solve. So when we talk about this issue, it's not just, outside, it's inside of our community. And we have to really begin to heal that as well. And ultimately, though, it begins with respect and love and care for women and understanding the value of women, mostly that Indigenous women are worthy. And so that's I think that the issues around First Nations people stem from outright racism. It stems from the insidious form of systemic and institutionalized racism, that if somebody is not an outright racist and they work in a system that has this kind of institutionalized or systemic racism, they become a part of that problem. And what underlies racism and systemic racism is hatred. And really, we have to start to think about going to the cause of these problems. And how do you begin? This is something I had talked about, and it's complicated. Maybe it's not complicated, but maybe we need to get ready for it. And that is, how do we begin to infuse the system with love, to infuse the systems that govern our lives with a sense of care and respect, and with values that reflect this worthiness of every human being, and particularly First Nation women.
We have a mutual friend, Chastity Davis, and she has an online program called DN, which is Canada's history through the lens of Indigenous women. And that's how I met you for the first time, was through Chastity online. We've only ever met online. Taking her course and hearing from the matriarchs, the original storytellers, the women, and their stories and their experiences, it changed a lot for me. And I've never heard from Indigenous women before. I've never heard their stories. I've heard the stories of men for sure, but not women so much. And I think a lot of Canadians don't even know that Indigenous women couldn't vote in this country until the 60s. Mm-hmm. Until the 60s, Indigenous women could not vote in Canada. That wasn't that long ago. We have a lot of work to do as Canadians.
Yeah. The other thing that happened is the system of belonging to communities that was really wiped out by colonialism and replaced with the Indian Act, with this system. It's like 6-1, 6-2 year number. And all of the men were in that system able to transfer and hand down their status as status Indians, but women were not. And so it became very patriarchal in terms of how our communities began to be formed. And so the patriarchy became a big part of our system because of the Indian Act. And women, not only were women not allowed to vote, but they would just simply lose their community status. They would be removed from the band list, they would be removed from their community, and they would lose all their rights when they married a non-Indigenous man. Men could marry non-Indigenous women, and those non-Indigenous women could get status. They could actually have a status card. And so you can see the double standard of how women and men are treated, but it is a colonial system. And the answer really is not only within First Nations, it's within your system. It's within the rest of Canada to actually, for matriarchs to rise within non-Indigenous communities and to ensure that we do have equity and equality as women, and that non-Indigenous women stand shoulder to shoulder with First Nation women, and that we move toward a more just society and a society that values women, period, and begins to, again, do these reparations that are needed in this country. Reparations cover all kinds of issues. So for women, what did the loss of their status do to them economically? How do you begin to make those reparations to women? Reparations is also about giving land back. First Nations were handed through the treaty process these very, very small parcels of land, while all of their lands were so much larger that they inhabited and used and actually received benefit from. And that's been cut off by the Indian Act and by the way that treaties have been interpreted by non-Indigenous people. So there is a lot of work to do. And I believe that women, non-Indigenous women, are an important part of changing this system. And we do that by moving into roles that are deemed important. Power, I think, is a male word. And for women, like for me, when I look at myself as the national chief, I really look at it in terms of the love and care that I can give to people. So I don't think about, oh, how powerful I am, but really what can I do with this platform that is called, what is my platform as the national chief? What can I do from this standpoint? How can I lift other people up? How can I amplify voices that have typically not been heard, particularly women, youth? And one of my platform items was to have a two-spirited LGBTQIA plus council at the AFN. There are many voices that haven't been heard, disabled people within First Nations. I mean, they're First Nations and they have that vulnerability. So there are voices that in this system, it's not just women, it's a wider group of vulnerable voices that need to be amplified. And the solutions from women and all of these different communities have to be brought forward and acted on. And I would say the same thing is true for women in the rest of Canada. So rise up, women.
It's time. Exactly. Okay, so I'm talking, about women, and I see you wearing your orange shirt pin. And we like to give back on our podcast and thank our guests for being here. So we ask our guests to choose a nonprofit organization in Canada. You chose the Orange Shirt Society. I just saw, again, online, Phyllis Webstad, who started the Orange Shirt Society yesterday. It's a nonprofit dedicated to supporting Indian residential school reconciliation, creating awareness of the impacts of residential schools, even though I agree with you, Chief, we should not be calling them schools, and to create awareness of the concept of every child matters. I did not know that the Orange Shirt Society did not get government funding. I had really no idea that they didn't get this support that, I just assumed they were, being given money and support for this, and they're not. So we're giving them $500 in your name to thank you for being here. Why did you choose the Orange Shirt Society?
Because of the time we're in, that we've all been impacted by the recovery of these little ones. All of us, we've always known, First Nations have always known that the brunt of colonialism is borne by our children. They're the ones who suffer the most. And we saw that with these institutions of assimilation and genocide, that our children were dying and not given proper ceremony and buried without a headstone. And, that tragedy really resonated with everyone. And that's why I wanted to lift up that organization, because they have created a level of awareness and created a symbol, this little orange shirt. This one I like because it has a little bit of a blingy thing to it. I just received this from Temiskaming First Nation in Quebec as a gift. But it has become a symbol of caring. It has become a symbol of that every child does matter, and that our children matter, and that we all care about our children. So that was the main reason.
Well, thank you for choosing them, and they will be receiving $500. So, as we finish things up, Chief, I'm curious, what does a healed country look like 100 years from now? What does a healed Canada look like to you?
It's diverse. I just saw another thing about the debate where they did a photo of all the white guys that are involved in the debate, in the French debate, and the lack of women, the lack of particularly women. And Jagmeet, Jagmeet held his space there as our one BIPOC figure. And that actually doesn't represent Canada. And that's what we need in 100 years. We need diversity of voices. We need women to be an active part of all levels of government. We need gender balance. We need men and women to be working together. And that's what I've talked about in my campaign when I ran, is that I look to my brothers, because I have 6 brothers. I had 6 brothers. One of them passed away. But I grew up with 6 brothers. And so that's how I see my counterparts across Canada as my brothers. And that's a big part of healing, is to know that my brothers are looking after me. My brothers are taking care of me, because that's what they did for my whole life and still do today, even though we're all much older. And it is a place where, I've always said my vision is happy, healthy children surrounded by the love and care of their families in safe and vibrant communities. That's the vision that we all have. And that to me would be a vision. If we can meet that in 100 years, then we've done a lot. And particularly with women, that women are valued, loved, cared for, and respected. That's a vision we have to work toward. And we have to really begin to understand the value of all human beings, and not just non-Native men who seem to inhabit all the roles, the important roles in our society. So that's what I would say is we've got to see a representational government and more color and more diversity.
National Chief, I can't thank you enough for being here. And it's an honor to speak with you. I'm grateful to discuss all of this with you. And it really, really, you've taught all of us something, and you lead by example. I know that. And I know you lead with your heart. And I know a lot of people who hold you in a very, they hold you high because you are such a wonderful person. So it's great to speak with you. If you want to learn more about the Assembly of First Nations and National Chief Roseanne Archibald, you can visit the website, which is afn.ca, or follow the Assembly of First Nations on Twitter at AF_updates or on Instagram and Facebook at Assembly of First Nations. We all have a role to play in our journey of reconciliation. If you want to learn more, I encourage you to read the 94 calls to action established as an outcome of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. To learn more about TELUS's commitments to reconciliation, you can visit telus.com/reconciliation.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, telus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TELUS Talks.